The woman known as Empress Wang was born into a family whose reputation was built on education, refinement, and careful navigation of the political currents that often determined survival in the Tang court. Her lineage, though not among the most militarily powerful, carried the weight of scholarly prestige, and her relatives had long understood that discretion was often more valuable than boldness in imperial politics. From an early age, she was trained to embody the virtues most prized in a consort: composure under pressure, graceful conduct in public, and the ability to adapt to the emperor's will without appearing to challenge it. This preparation was not accidental. In the Tang dynasty's complex hierarchy, the role of empress was both highly honored and perilously exposed. Families who placed their daughters in the palace understood the risks as clearly as the opportunities. For the Wang household, securing this position was a calculated step to anchor their influence within the inner court without appearing overly ambitious in the eyes of rivals. Her entry into the palace was marked by ceremony and expectation. The selection of an empress was never merely a personal choice for the emperor. It was a decision with far-reaching political consequences. Emperor Gaozong, who had ascended the throne after his father Taizong's long reign, faced a court still balancing loyalties between old factions and emerging new powers. Choosing Wang, a woman from a respected but politically cautious background, was a statement of stability. She came with no dominant clan ready to overshadow the imperial house, no powerful military relatives to disrupt the balance, and no history of factional intrigue that might threaten the emperor's own authority. Once installed as empress, Wang assumed the responsibilities expected of her station. She oversaw the inner palace with formality and restraint, managing the ranks of consorts, the ceremonial calendar, and the rituals that maintained the imperial household's dignity. The empress was not merely a symbolic presence. Her role required ensuring harmony within the palace, controlling resources, and keeping the emperor's domestic affairs in order. In this early period, her ability to maintain order and avoid scandal was viewed as an asset. Ministers saw in her a guardian of tradition, and her demeanor reassured the court that Gaozong's reign would not be destabilized by internal disputes among the women closest to him. Yet the very qualities that secured her position, patience, formality, and deference, also made her less visible in the emperor's daily decision-making. In the Tang imperial structure, influence depended not only on ceremonial authority, but on access, persuasion, and the ability to shape the ruler's thinking in private. While Empress Wang's public image was impeccable, her political instincts were shaped by a culture of caution. She rarely pressed her own views in state matters, and often deferred to the emperor's preferences without challenge. This restraint, while in keeping with her upbringing, left her vulnerable in a court where personal proximity to the ruler could outweigh official rank. The Tang court itself was a space of constant negotiation between civil officials, military leaders, and the inner palace. Every appointment, every audience with the emperor could shift the balance of influence. It was in this environment that the first signs of change began to emerge. As Gaozong's reign matured, his reliance on private counsel and personal confidants grew, opening opportunities for figures outside the formal hierarchy to shape policy. For an empress who valued protocol over persuasion, this was an early warning of how quickly the ground beneath her could shift. Her initial years as empress were thus defined by a subtle tension. Outwardly, she represented the ideal of stability, presiding over palace rituals with precision and maintaining a careful distance from overt political disputes. Inwardly, she occupied a position that demanded vigilance against rivals whose ambitions might find a path to the emperor's ear. The Wang family's decision to avoid entangling themselves in the factional struggles of the capital may have kept them safe from immediate danger, but it also deprived the empress of the powerful backing that could deter those seeking her place. In the complex interplay of Tang politics, a lack of strong allies could be as dangerous as openly declared enemies. As Gaozong's reign progressed, subtle changes in the rhythm of palace life began to alter the patterns that had sustained her authority. New faces appeared in the emperor's private quarters, and audiences that once passed through the empress's supervision were occasionally conducted without her knowledge. The palace was not a static institution. It adapted to the ruler's preferences, and each adjustment carried consequences for the established order. Empress Wang's place in that order was secure in name, but names alone could not guarantee influence in the face of shifting loyalties. This was the unspoken reality of her early reign. The empress's crown was both a shield and a target. The prestige it carried protected her from lesser intrigues, but it also marked her as the central obstacle for any who aspired to reshape the inner court. And in the years to come, one such figure would arrive, not as an open rival, but as a presence whose ambition and resourcefulness would challenge every certainty the empress had relied upon. Wu Jao's return to the palace marked a departure from the quiet rhythms Empress Wang had grown accustomed to. Formerly a concubine of the late Emperor Taizong, she had left court life to serve in a Buddhist convent after his death. As was customary for women of the harem who had no further claim in the new reign. Her reappearance, now under Gaozong, was unusual and carried political undertones that could not be ignored. Gaozong had encountered her again during a temple visit, and her re-entry into the inner court came not through the structured channels overseen by the empress, but through the emperor's personal will. This alone made her presence different from other consorts, who typically rose through established ranks and obligations. From the beginning, Wu Jao distinguished herself by a decisiveness rarely displayed among the palace women. She moved easily between ceremonial duties and private counsel, showing a readiness to engage with matters that reached beyond the inner chambers. Gaozong found her conversation stimulating, and she began to occupy more of his time in ways that were visible to the court. While other consorts relied on beauty or compliance to maintain favor, Wu Zhao's value to the emperor extended to matters of governance, where she demonstrated both awareness of policy and the courage to speak plainly. Empress Wang initially regarded her as a temporary diversion. The palace had seen many favorites rise and fade, often leaving no trace on the structure of power. Wu Zhao's background, however, made her unlike the rest. Having served under Taizong, she possessed insight into imperial politics from 2 reigns, and her years away had not diminished her ability to maneuver. Instead of competing with the empress in traditional roles of beauty and ceremony, Wu Jao positioned herself as an indispensable partner to the emperor in both personal and state affairs. The effect on the balance of influence was subtle at first, but soon became undeniable. Matters that once came to the empress's attention only after passing through layers of protocol now bypassed her entirely. Gaozong's reliance on Wu Jao grew with each passing month, and her ability to secure small but significant appointments for her allies signaled that her role was expanding. She did not openly challenge the Empress, but her presence reduced Wang's opportunities to guide the Emperor's decisions. In the competitive environment of the Tang court, such shifts were understood as precursors to larger changes. This growing preference placed Wang in an increasingly defensive position. Her authority over the palace remained intact in name, but influence in the emperor's mind was drifting elsewhere. Attempts to reassert her position through formal channels, through rituals, honors, and courtly responsibilities could not match the direct access Wu Jao enjoyed. Ministers who valued their standing began adjusting their allegiances quietly, knowing that access to the emperor might now depend on Wu Jao's approval as much as the empress's. The implications for court politics were far-reaching. An empress without the emperor's full confidence could be sidelined in critical matters of succession, appointments, and the shaping of imperial policy. For Wang, the realization came gradually, as she saw her own role in the emperor's life narrowing. The woman she had once dismissed as a passing interest was positioning herself not as a rival consort, but as a partner in rule, and the court was beginning to treat her as such. Empress Wong retained the outward symbols of her rank, the authority to manage the inner court, preside over rituals, and serve as the official counterpart to the emperor in matters of ceremony. Yet the locus of real influence was shifting away from these visible duties and toward the private conversations that took place behind closed doors. Wu Zhao's presence in these discussions altered the flow of decision-making. She did not seek to replace the empress in the formal hierarchy. Instead, she occupied a space that existed outside of it, where the emperor's thoughts could be shaped before they reached the council chambers. This shift was not immediately visible to those beyond the palace walls, but within its corridors it was unmistakable. The ministers and attendants who once brought petitions through the empress's channels began redirecting their efforts. Those with the most to gain understood that decisions were now influenced less by formal endorsement and more by who could speak to the emperor in moments unguarded by ceremony. Wu Zhao's ability to secure audiences and introduce policy suggestions quietly without the procedural delays of court protocol made her an increasingly valuable intermediary. The empress's own role in these matters became more reactive, confined to approving decisions already shaped by another's counsel. Wang attempted to counter this erosion of influence through the tools available to her. She intensified her oversight of palace operations, reinforced alliances with trusted attendants, and sought to remind the court of her senior position through displays of authority during official gatherings. But these efforts, while preserving her dignity, could not reverse the growing perception that the emperor relied on Wu Zhao for matters that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of a consort's influence. Each move to reassert herself seemed only to underscore the distance that had formed between her and the emperor's inner deliberations. The Tang court's political culture magnified these shifts. Influence was not measured solely in titles or ceremonial precedents, but in the capacity to shape the emperor's decisions before they were presented in council. A ruler's private confidant, especially one who could engage on matters of governance, could become more powerful than any official rank. Wu Zhao's position, secured by the emperor's trust, made her indispensable in ways the empress could not easily match without overstepping the boundaries expected of her station. The danger for Wang was that her authority might remain intact in form while hollowed out in function, a reality that could not be acknowledged openly, yet was felt in every transaction of court life. For those watching from the sidelines, the shift in alliances was telling. High-ranking officials who had once sought the Empress's support began aligning themselves with Wu Jao's network, calculating that her proximity to the emperor made her the more effective patron. These realignments were not openly declared, but revealed themselves in appointments, recommendations, and the quiet circulation of information. The Empress's circle, once a hub of influence, was contracting, leaving her increasingly dependent on the formal structures of her role, rather than the fluid networks of loyalty that truly sustained power at court. This gradual displacement unfolded without a single decisive confrontation. It was instead the accumulation of small changes, audiences missed, petitions diverted, policy discussions held without her presence, that reshaped the political order within the palace. The Empress could sense the trajectory, yet the customs of her position constrained how directly she could oppose it. In the town court, resistance that appeared too overt could be read as disloyalty, and even a hint of such suspicion could destroy the very position she sought to defend. As these constraints tightened, the space in which she could act continued to narrow, even as her rival's influence deepened. Empress Wang's isolation within the palace deepened as Wu Jao's position solidified, leaving her with few remaining channels through which to exert influence. In this narrowing space, she turned toward individuals who had once served the late Empress Wende, Gaozong's mother, whose legacy still held moral authority in the court. These figures, some holding official positions and others reduced to more ceremonial roles, shared a common unease at the rapid ascent of Wu Jao and the erosion of established order. Their alignment with Wang was not forged in public declarations, but in discreet exchanges, where the shared memory of Wende's reign served as a point of unity. The practical aim of these connections was to reinforce Wang's legitimacy as the rightful consort and to slow the spread of her rival's influence. Such efforts took the form of reinforcing her presence in courtly rituals, ensuring her authority over certain appointments within the palace, and quietly advising ministers to preserve traditional lines of access to the emperor through her. These were small measures, but in the context of palace politics, where perception could be as decisive as formal decree, they represented an attempt to reclaim the ground she was steadily losing. However, alliances in the Tang court were never without risk. The very act of aligning with those tied to a former regime could be interpreted as a political maneuver against the present order. Any suggestion that Wang sought to build a counterweight to Wu Jao could, if exposed, be framed as disloyalty to the emperor himself. Ministers and attendants who interacted with her were aware of this danger, and their cooperation was tempered by the need to protect their own positions. This caution meant that even among her allies, there was hesitancy to act too openly, limiting the strength of the coalition she sought to assemble. The delicate balance was made more precarious by the palace's constant scrutiny. Servants carried not only messages, but also information, and the flow of small observations from one household to another allowed both allies and adversaries to track the shifting alignments within the court. Wu Zhao's growing network was adept at detecting changes in the political landscape, and the formation of even an informal bloc around the empress would not go unnoticed for long. In this environment, each meeting, each shared confidence, carried the possibility of being reported to the emperor in a manner that could cast it as subversive. Wang's strategy relied on subtle obstruction rather than open confrontation. By slowing or complicating initiatives tied to Wu Jao's supporters, she aimed to create the impression that her rival's reach was not yet complete. This could delay certain appointments or influence which petitions reached the emperor's attention. Yet each act of obstruction, however minor, risked exposure. The line between protecting her position and appearing to conspire against imperial will was thin, and in a court where personal loyalty was valued above procedural correctness, it was a dangerous one to approach. As weeks turned into months, the Empress's reliance on these alliances underscored the shifting nature of her authority. She still held the title and ceremonial precedence, but the strength of her position increasingly depended on a network that operated in the shadows of the formal court. The very act of preserving her status now required her to play by the same unwritten rules that had elevated her rival, a reality that reflected the changing structure of power within the palace. It was a transformation that placed her not only in opposition to Wu Jao, but in a posture that could be interpreted as standing apart from the emperor's chosen direction, a perception that in the Tang court carried its own peril. The birth of a daughter to Emperor Gaozong and Wu Jao marked a turning point in the atmosphere of the Tang court. While the arrival of an imperial child traditionally strengthened the dynasty and reaffirmed the stability of the ruling family, in this case it carried deeper political weight. For Wu Jao, the child was not only a personal bond with the emperor, but a living symbol of her growing legitimacy. Her influence, already substantial, now extended into the matter of succession, and even a daughter, not yet a potential heir in a male-dominated hierarchy, could serve as a focal point for consolidating her position. The court responded with the formalities and public congratulations expected of such an event, but beneath the surface, it also recalculated its loyalties. Those who had hesitated to align themselves fully with Wu Jao now saw in her motherhood a claim to permanence that was difficult to ignore. For Empress Wang, the event carried a different meaning. She had no surviving children of her own, with Gaozong, a fact that had long been a quiet vulnerability in her position. In the intricate structure of the Tang imperial household, the role of an empress was bound not only to her ceremonial duties, but to her ability to provide heirs. The birth of Wu Zhao's daughter deepened the perception that Wang's role as the emperor's principal wife was increasingly symbolic, while another woman supplied the personal and dynastic connections that secured real influence. Wang maintained the composure her station required, overseeing court rituals with the same precision as before. But the political significance of the child's existence could not be disguised. The months following the birth brought both celebration and new lines of tension. Wu Zhao's access to the emperor grew even more frequent, and her place in family affairs, from the child's care to the emperor's private schedule, further displaced the empress from the daily life of the ruler. In this environment, even small gestures took on political meaning. Who held the child during public audiences, who oversaw her upbringing, and who was present in moments of illness or ceremony, all became indicators of where the emperor's trust truly rested. When tragedy struck and the infant died unexpectedly, the court was thrown into uncertainty. The loss of a child in the palace was not unprecedented, but in a court already divided, grief quickly intertwined with suspicion. The question of cause moved quietly through the palace corridors, whispered among attendants, and speculated on by officials who understood the stakes. The death of Wu Jao's daughter removed a potential rival in the succession hierarchy for other consorts' children. But it also struck at the personal bond between Wu Jao and the emperor, a wound that could be turned into political advantage if directed toward an enemy. In this climate, Empress Wang became the focus of unproven but damaging insinuations. The mere possibility that she might have had a hand in the child's death, regardless of evidence, was enough to weaken her already fragile standing. The court's culture allowed for suspicion to carry as much weight as fact, especially when it came from those closest to the emperor. Once such an idea was placed before him, it could never fully be erased. In the logic of palace politics, the appearance of threat was sometimes as dangerous as the act itself, and in the minds of many, the empress had both motive and the access that could make such an accusation plausible. This shift was not the product of a single confrontation, but of the way the event was interpreted and repeated. Each retelling in the private spaces of the palace reinforced the association between the child's death and the empress, until the connection became part of the court's unspoken understanding of the tragedy. Whether or not Gaozong believed the accusation entirely, the seed of doubt altered his view of Wang. In a court where trust determined survival, that doubt was enough to deepen her isolation and further strengthen the position of her rival. Emperor Gaozong's early years on the throne had been marked by a steady loyalty to Empress Wang, a bond that protected her against the shifting currents of palace politics. That loyalty had once been strong enough to quiet rumors, overlook missteps, and keep rivals at a distance. But the death of Wu Jao's daughter and the quiet persistence of suspicion altered the balance. What had been a reflexive trust was now tempered by uncertainty, and in the Tang court, the smallest shadow over an empress's reputation could grow into a justification for removal. The emperor no longer looked to Wang with the same unquestioning confidence, and this change was noticed by all who surrounded him. The process was gradual, carried not by a single accusation, but by the accumulation of impressions and counsel. Certain advisers, sensing the emperor's hesitancy, began to frame her continued presence as a risk to stability. They spoke of harmony in the inner court, of the dangers of divided loyalties, and of the necessity for a ruler to maintain confidence in those closest to him. None directly called for her dismissal, but the implication was clear. An empress who had lost the emperor's trust could not fulfill her role without undermining the authority of the throne. Such counsel found a receptive audience in Gaozong, whose dependence on Wu Zhao's insight had deepened in recent years. Wu Zhao's influence in this period was marked not by open confrontation with Wang, but by her indispensability to the emperor. She had positioned herself as a partner in governance, able to address matters of state with the same fluency as court ministers. Her readiness to handle both administrative details and the subtler politics of the capital reinforced the perception that she was not only loyal but effective. As Gaozong's reliance on her judgment grew, the contrast with Wang's more traditional ceremonial role became harder to ignore. In an environment where access and counsel were the currency of influence, the Empress was being outmatched. Wang, aware of her declining standing, sought to reassert herself. She emphasized her lineage, her record of service as Empress, and the stability she had once brought to the inner court. But in attempting to defend her place, she often found her actions interpreted as self-preservation rather than service to the dynasty. The more she attempted to reclaim the emperor's favor, the more it seemed to confirm the narrative that her position was no longer secure on its own merits. The court, attuned to these shifts, began to adjust its behavior. Officials who had once balanced their loyalties between the two women now increasingly oriented themselves toward Wu Jao's camp, calculating that the emperor's confidence in her would shape future appointments and decisions. The empress's circle contracted, and with it, her ability to influence events beyond the ceremonial sphere. Even her family's position in the wider political order began to weaken, as association with her was no longer seen as a guarantee of imperial favor. In the palace, the change was felt in the smallest details. Invitations to private discussions became less frequent. Matters once referred to her for approval passed directly to the emperor without her knowledge. On occasions where she was present, the exchanges between Gaozong and Wu Jao carried an ease and familiarity that underscored her own exclusion. The cumulative effect was a quiet isolation, not enforced by decree, but by the steady narrowing of her role in the emperor's life. For Wang, the danger lay in the fact that this isolation was both political and personal. In the Tang court, where the ruler's will defined legitimacy, an empress without the emperor's trust was already living on borrowed authority. The combination of hostile whispers from advisors and the unbroken presence of a favored rival left her without room to maneuver, trapped in a position where every action could be read as either ineffectual or disloyal. The decision to remove Empress Wang unfolded not in the open chambers of state, but in the sealed rooms of the inner palace, where the emperor's word carried the weight of final judgment without the need for public proceedings. In the Tang court, the dismissal of an empress was not a matter of legal trial, but of imperial will, shaped by the counsel of those who held the ruler's confidence. Once that will shifted decisively, the mechanisms to enforce it moved swiftly and without appeal. No formal accusations were read before the assembled ministers. No opportunity for defense was granted. The process was designed to protect the dignity of the throne, but it also ensured that the decision could not be contested by the wider bureaucracy. The first signs of her removal came quietly. Attendants once assigned to her service were reassigned to other quarters, leaving her surrounded by unfamiliar faces whose loyalties were not her own. Access to the emperor was curtailed without formal declaration, replaced by messages delivered through intermediaries. The ceremonial privileges of her rank, from the seating she occupied to the regalia she wore, were withdrawn in increments, each change small enough to pass without public notice, but significant enough to diminish her presence in the palace hierarchy. By the time an imperial order confirmed her deposition, the practical functions of her authority had already been dismantled. Confined to her private quarters, she lived under a watchfulness that left no action unnoticed. Every visitor required approval. Every letter passed through the hands of palace officials before it could leave her rooms. What had once been a stage for the careful display of imperial dignity became a space defined by restriction, where movement was measured and conversation weighed for its potential to be reported. The silence that surrounded her was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate isolation that cut her off from allies and prevented her from shaping the narrative of her fall. In the absence of a public accounting, the reasons for her removal became matters of record only within the emperor's circle. To the outside world, the change could be explained as a matter of palace order, a natural adjustment in the composition of the imperial household. Within the court, however, it was understood that her position had been undone by the combination of political vulnerability, the emperor's waning trust, and the steady influence of a rival whose counsel had become indispensable. Once the decision had been made, the apparatus of the Tang state moved to ensure that it could not be reversed. The impact of this removal extended beyond the empress herself. Her family, once secure in their connection to the throne, found their standing diminished, and those who had tied their fortunes to her influence adjusted their loyalties to align with the new balance of power. The reshaping of the court's hierarchy was immediate, with Wu Jao assuming the central role in the inner palace and expanding her reach into the emperor's political affairs. The swiftness of this transition demonstrated both the fragility of imperial favor and the speed with which the structures of the palace could be reorganized when the ruler's will demanded it. For Wang, the transformation from empress to prisoner was completed without public confrontation, yet its effect was absolute. Her life was now confined to a narrow set of rooms within the palace walls, her influence reduced to nothing, her name still recorded in the annals, but stripped of its living authority. The same walls that had once been the backdrop to her highest ceremonies now enclosed her in silence, a reminder that in the Tang court, power could be taken away as decisively as it was granted. In the imperial records, the removal of Empress Wong was recorded with brevity, reduced to a formal statement that marked the change in title and rank. To the bureaucracy and the wider empire, it appeared as a swift and orderly transition, consistent with the traditions of the Tang court. Yet within the palace walls, the process was neither quick nor without personal cost. It unfolded in a series of quiet but deliberate steps that stripped Wang not only of her authority, but of the identity she had carried for years. Servants who had attended her daily were reassigned to other posts, some sent to distant quarters of the palace, where their paths would never cross hers again. Without the familiar presence of trusted attendants, the routines that had anchored her life as empress began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of displacement that pervaded every part of her existence. The removal of her seals was one of the most symbolic acts in this process. The official seals represented her capacity to authorize palace orders, to grant audiences, and to speak in the emperor's name in matters concerning the inner court. Their confiscation was not done in haste, but in a measured, ceremonial manner, ensuring there was no possibility of their use without imperial consent. Once removed, her capacity to intervene in any administrative matter ceased entirely. The loss was more than administrative. It was the final severing of her role in the governance of the palace, a confirmation that her authority no longer extended beyond the threshold of her assigned quarters. Erasure from ceremonial precedence was a quieter but equally devastating blow. In the rigid hierarchy of the Tang court, the order of precedence determined visibility, influence, and the right to be acknowledged in formal settings. The alteration of official rosters and ceremonial plans ensured that her name would no longer be called in the proper sequence, her place in processions removed, her presence at major rituals either excluded or relegated to a position that made her status unrecognizable. Without public appearances in the role of empress, her image before the court began to fade, and with it the memory of her as the emperor's principal wife. As these changes took effect, Wu Jao's presence filled the space Wang had once occupied. Her role expanded not only in the private sphere but in the public functions of the court, and her influence over state matters became more visible. The ascension of Wu Jao was not simply the displacement of one woman by another. It was the redefinition of what the role could be. Wu Jao approached the position with political acumen and an assertiveness uncommon in imperial consorts, building her authority through direct involvement in governance. Her rise reframed the court's expectations, making Wang's earlier style of restrained and ceremonial leadership seem inadequate in comparison. This shift was reinforced by the way the court began to remember Wang's tenure. Without her presence to counter the narrative, her years as empress became a cautionary tale repeated among the palace staff, a story of how holding to tradition and caution could leave one vulnerable to a more dynamic rival. The details of her contributions to the stability of Gaozong's early reign were quietly omitted in favor of a narrative that emphasized her political inaction and inability to adapt. In an environment where memory was shaped as much by the current holders of power as by official records, her legacy was being rewritten in real time. For the women of the inner court, the fall of Empress Wang served as a visible reminder of the fragility of imperial favor. Her removal demonstrated that no title, however exalted, could survive a loss of influence with the ruler, and that the formal structures of the palace could be reshaped quickly when the emperor's will aligned with the ambitions of another. The cautionary aspect of her downfall was not lost on them. Each knew that their own standing depended on maintaining both the emperor's trust and the political networks that sustained it. The psychological impact of this erasure was profound. A woman who had once stood at the ceremonial heart of the Tang court now moved in its shadows, seen but not acknowledged, her former allies absorbed into the service of her successor. The spaces she had once commanded were now presided over by Wu Jao, and the rituals she had led were performed without any recognition of her past role. The transformation was complete, not only in function, but in perception. To those who entered the palace after her removal, she was simply another former consort, her identity as empress preserved only in the fading recollections of those who had served under her reign. Wu Zhao's ascension marked more than a change in personnel. It was an inflection point in the history of the Tang Dynasty. By stepping into the position with decisive authority, she demonstrated a model of imperial partnership that was far more active and direct than Wang's approach, signaling to the court and the empire that the inner palace could be a seat of political power in its own right. This transformation, while elevating Wu Zhao, also ensured that Wang's story would be remembered in contrast, a reminder of the cost of losing relevance in an environment where proximity to the ruler defined survival. In the years that followed her removal, Wang's life contracted to the narrow boundaries of her confinement. The quarters assigned to her were within the palace walls, yet far from its central halls, positioned in a way that kept her physically close to the heart of power, but entirely excluded from it. The isolation was deliberate, denying her the means to re-establish contact with allies while ensuring she remained under constant observation. Movement outside her chambers required approval, and even then, her path was escorted and controlled. Conversations were measured, and every visitor who crossed her threshold was either bound by loyalty to her successor or by the necessity of reporting their words to those in authority. The news that reached her did so through the quiet remarks of attendants or the overheard exchanges of guards, fragments of the outside world that revealed more by implication than by direct statement. From these fragments, she came to understand the full extent of Wu Jao's transformation from imperial consort to dominant political figure. The titles she held, the audiences she commanded, the decisions she influenced. Each new detail confirmed that Wu's reach now extended beyond the inner palace into the highest levels of state governance. These accounts carried no explicit malice, yet for Wang, they were reminders of the authority she had once held and the permanence of her exclusion from it. Her daily life became a routine of absence, defined by the ceremonies she no longer attended and the decisions she no longer shaped. The formal rituals of the court continued without her, each one reinforcing her removal through her absence from the prescribed order of precedence. Where her name had once been spoken as part of the imperial household, it was now absent from official announcements, replaced entirely by that of her successor. This quiet omission was as decisive as any decree, signaling to all that her role in the dynasty's present and future had ended. The psychological weight of this silence was compounded by the unchanging nature of her surroundings. The palace she inhabited had been the stage of her highest authority, yet now the same walls served as a barrier between her and the life she had once known. The familiar architecture, the patterns of light and shadow in its courtyards, were constant reminders that she lived in the same physical space but in an entirely different reality. The distance between her current life and her past was measured not in miles, but in the loss of recognition, the absence of authority, and the erosion of personal identity within the imperial structure. For those within the palace who remembered her tenure, her presence was a reminder of the instability of imperial favor. Servants who had witnessed her rise and fall carried the memory of how swiftly the balance of power could shift, and some regarded her continued existence in the palace as a warning. The very fact that she remained there, visible yet powerless, underscored that an empress could be set aside without ceremony and live out her days watching another occupy her former place. This awareness was not lost on other women of the court, whose own security depended entirely on the emperor's will and the political currents surrounding him. Beyond the palace, the dynasty moved forward with little acknowledgement of her situation. Records focused on the achievements and initiatives of Wu Jao, whose growing prominence overshadowed all else. The empire's attention was drawn to reforms, foreign diplomacy, and the consolidation of power at the center, leaving no space for public reflection on the fate of the woman who had once been its ceremonial figurehead. Yet within the confined corridors she inhabited, the changes in the empire were experienced through the filtered accounts of others, each one a reminder that she had no part in shaping them. The slow passage of time in confinement gave a sense of permanence to her position, yet the political reality of the court meant that permanence was always relative. Her existence as a deposed empress served as a caution that the same forces that had replaced her could just as easily turn against others. In this way, her presence endured not through formal acknowledgement but as an unspoken truth within the palace that no title, however exalted, was beyond removal, and that every rise carried within it the possibility of a fall. Empress Wang's final years passed without public notice, ending far from the rituals, processions, and ceremonial authority that had once defined her position. Stripped of her rank and confined to the narrow world permitted to a deposed consort, she lived beyond the reach of state affairs, her name absent from proclamations, and her image erased from courtly displays. Yet the circumstances of her fall did not vanish with her. Within the town court, her story became part of the silent knowledge that shaped the behavior of officials, attendants, and imperial consorts for generations. Her rise had been built on lineage, composure, and adherence to tradition, but her decline revealed the limits of those qualities when confronted with a rival who understood that proximity to power could be transformed into the power to rule. Her removal created a vacuum at the center of the palace that Wu Jao filled with unprecedented decisiveness. No longer constrained by the need to maneuver around an established empress, Wu consolidated her position as Gaozong's closest political partner and extended her reach into areas of governance that had previously been beyond the influence of any woman in the Tang dynasty. She oversaw appointments, influenced policy, and gradually established her authority as co-ruler in all but name. When Gaozong's health began to decline, her role expanded further, placing her at the helm of decision-making and allowing her to set precedents that would eventually make it possible for her to declare herself emperor in her own right. The transformation of Wu Jao into Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as sovereign, was inseparable from the fate of Empress Wang. Without Wang's deposition, the path to such concentrated authority might have remained blocked by the traditions that defined the empress's role as symbolic and ceremonial. By removing Wang, Wu Jao not only eliminated a rival, but reshaped the office itself, redefining the relationship between the inner palace and the machinery of state. This shift had consequences beyond her lifetime, influencing how power could be accumulated, maintained, and transferred within the imperial system. In the historical record, the causes of Wang's downfall remain a subject of debate. Some accounts, shaped by the narratives that favored Wu Zetian, portray Wang as politically passive, unable, or unwilling to adapt to the demands of a court where influence depended on direct engagement with the ruler's decision-making. Others suggest that her position had been untenable from the moment Wu Jao re-entered the palace, and that her removal was the inevitable result of facing a rival with both the will and the capacity to overcome the established order. In either reading, her fall illustrates the unforgiving nature of imperial politics, where status without the means to actively defend it could not be sustained. Her legacy within the Tang court was less a matter of personal remembrance than of political caution. For consorts, it was a reminder that the emperor's favor could shift rapidly, and that survival required more than the fulfillment of ceremonial duties. For ministers, it underscored the risks of aligning too closely with a figure whose influence rested on a single relationship, however secure it might seem. Even for later empresses, the memory of Wang's removal lingered as an example of how legitimacy could be undone without public trial or formal charges, charges replaced quietly and irrevocably by another. Outside the palace, the wider empire took little note of her absence, as the political and cultural focus shifted toward Wu Zetian's administration and reforms. Yet among those who understood the workings of the court, Wang's story endured in a form that was neither full condemnation nor unqualified sympathy. She was remembered as a figure who had held the highest title available to a woman in the Tang Dynasty, only to lose it without the ability to reclaim her standing. The simplicity of her official record concealed the complexity of the forces that had shaped her fate: ambition, shifting alliances, imperial preference, and the structural vulnerabilities of the position she held. Her life and downfall became an unspoken measure against which later power struggles were judged. In the fragile balance between tradition and adaptation, she represented the risks of holding too firmly to established forms when the nature of power was changing. Wu Zetian's rise demonstrated the opposite, that by redefining rules and challenging precedent, it was possible to achieve a form of authority no woman before her had attained. Together, their intertwined histories reflected both the constraints and the possibilities within the imperial system, each shaped by the other's presence and absence. In the end, Empress Wang's lost throne was not merely a personal tragedy, but a turning point in the history of the Tang Dynasty. Her removal marked the end of one vision of the Empress's role and the beginning of another that would alter the political structure of the empire. The lessons drawn from her fate continued to influence palace politics long after her death, not through official commemoration, but through the quiet recognition that her story had shown how fragile power could be and how completely it could be taken away.